our Maundy Thursday service. We're trying something a little bit different. I'm going to be offering you a few different viewpoints of that evening, that Last Supper evening. First, we'll be hearing from the disciple John, who would have reclined next to our Lord at that night's celebration. Then we'll hear from his brother James, whose faithfulness never wavered. Then from that remarkable, tough, independent, foot-in-mouth disciple Peter. And at last, a word from Mary Magdalene, whose life was transformed by Jesus, and who became a faithful follower, one of the few that stood at the cross and never turned away. I've adapted this from a writing by Ronnie McBrayer entitled The Dark Thursday Night. And let's begin with our story with John, one of the sons of thunder.
It was just, John recalls that night in the upper room.
It was just before the Passover, and I thought Jesus would stay back in Bethany for the feast. But he insisted that we return to Jerusalem. Go into the city, he said. A friend of mine will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. Peter and I went where he told us to go, and the owner of the building gave us entry and told us to help ourselves. So we made preparation for the Seder meal. Peter went on to the market to get the herbs, the matzah, and the wine. The bitter herbs he would find there in plenty at the busy market. They would remind us of the bitter slavery of our ancestors in Egypt. He would bring back the traditional matzah bread, unleavened, a bread that didn't need time to rise, to remember that our forefathers had to go quickly to escape their chains. And the wine, a deep red wine, to remind us of the blood of the little lambs that had marked the door frames of God's people, saving us for the Exodus. It was an offering as much as any blood offering laid on the altar. It reminds us again, as we celebrate this Passover, that freedom is not without sacrifice. It was the same meal as every other year of my life with my parents and grandparents, and for these last few years with Jesus. And I remember thinking, this one will be like no other I would ever have, a Jubilee Passover, and to spend it with the Master. It would be a night to remember, I thought. I roasted the lamb myself this time. Peter is no good at such things. He tends to be too impatient. I was glad he arrived back with everything on his list, because I know him well enough to know he spent time haggling over the price of olive oil and arguing for the best wine for our dinner. But to be fair, he didn't disappoint us. Everything was the best. Jesus and the rest of our group arrived just before evening could settle in. The sun was nearing the horizon as they came through the door, and the sweet breeze of the fresh spring evening mingled with the savory smell of the lamb on the fire, and everyone was in high spirits. Passover is a time of contemplation, but also a time of celebration. The Seder is a time of fellowship and camaraderie. It is tradition mixed with passion, stirred together with that once-a-year opportunity to exchange ideas, to come together as a family, and sometimes share a year's worth of news. As I finished the lamb, I was smiling as I listened to Simon arguing politics with Nathaniel. Thomas was standing near the window, watching and waiting for the last disciples to come in. He was always on watch. Judas was distracted, I noticed, somber and uneasy. He carried the money, and I suppose it was natural to be on your guard with so much responsibility. And my brother James, always last in. came straight over to sniff at the lamb, convinced that I had ruined it, and I don't know why he expects the worst when I'm by far the better cook. Anyway, he took a taste and smiled, that special smile he flashed when we were kids, and he even tousled my hair like the time I finally mastered the throwing of the net from the bow of our father's boat. I was glad I had him there to celebrate this special Passover meal. As I readied the lamb and laid it on the platter, I looked up to see Jesus quietly watching me. He seemed uncharacteristically solemn. I'd grown used to seeing a quick smile, often with a mischievous light in his eyes. But tonight, he seemed so burdened. We gathered around the table to eat, and Jesus stood up and offered our prayer. He spoke the familiar prayer, and we all joined in with a Kiddush. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who chose us from all the nations and gave us with love Sabbaths for rest, festivals for happiness, holidays for joy, and this path of Passover for our freedom. He stopped, and I barely heard him because he spoke scarcely more than a whisper.
I tell you the truth. One of you will betray me.
We were all shocked, and then responded, as you might imagine, denying that such a thing could be possible. I leaned against him and asked, "Who, Lord?" He murmured an answer that didn't make sense at the time, and instead he told us to begin our meal. And we were soon deep in conversation. It had been, after all, such a remarkable few weeks. And we just spent time with our old friends, Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Oh, the miracle of Lazarus was worth retelling. But who didn't know it already? And the entry into the city, oh, what a triumph! And the music, the crowds, the smells, the commerce. Jerusalem had never been so full of people. And noise, oh, the noise. But as the sun set and the day officially ended, as the first 3 stars pierced through a deep sky, the sounds died away. We opened the window and could hear an old voice lifting up a familiar song of praise that somehow had found its way through the streets below. And it reminded us that in the middle of all this, we were here to celebrate our faith. The God of Abraham praise, who reigns enthroned above, ancient of everlasting days and God of love. Jehovah great, I am by earth and heaven confessed. I bow and bless the sacred name forever blessed. The God who reigns on high, the great archangels sing, and holy, holy, holy cry, Almighty King, who was and is the same, and evermore shall be. Jehovah, Lord, the great I am, we worship thee. Once the meal was over, Jesus stood up and took a fresh piece of bread in his hand. He broke it into pieces and began to hand it around to us all. And before we ate, he said to us,
This is my body. Eat it and remember me.
It was an unusual command. And as the questions began to form in my head, Jesus took the chalice before him and said similar words.
This is my blood, which is poured out for many and for you. Every time you gather like this, I tell you to drink it and to remember me.
The red wine, our symbol of the blood of the sacrificial lamb that had stood between us and the curse that fell on the Egyptians. As I drank it, I remembered once more the curses that our God had barred from our doors that night so very long ago. Evil was very much present then, and it is now, but it is not our master. It is to be recognized, but not feared. For in the end, it is always God who has the upper hand over evil. Always. Oh, so much more I could tell. Our Lord teaching us and serving us, washing us and preparing us before we could understand anything. And then the garden. The meal ended and we gathered ourselves together and started for the garden.
Here is what James remembers.
We followed Jesus from the upper room to Gethsemane. It wasn't far, a mile or so. It would have been closer had we crossed the temple grounds. Jesus seemed to want nothing more to do with the temple. So we twisted our way through the upper city, an alley here, a sidewalk there, until we made our way into that blessed olive grove. Felt right to be here, like stepping into the arms of an old friend, familiar. We had come so often here to pray and rest, to listen to the Master's stories and find a few moments of respite. Jesus loved that place. The rabbis say the trees in Gethsemane are as old as Abraham. It is good to think on that, to connect with our own ancient roots, especially at Passover. On that night, that dark Thursday night, Gethsemane smelled of a rich earth and new life as the old trees were once again budding and promising a new season. The other followers found a good place to settle down, joining together softly in prayer. Peter and my brother John and I pressed in deeper under the canopy with Jesus. He was always intense in prayer, but tonight there was a heaviness that I think we all sensed. And I can say for me, I could feel it, almost radiating from him. Even so, it caught me off guard when he turned to me, looked almost through me, and said,
James, my soul is drowning in grief. Please pray for me and keep watch.
Jesus said, pray for me. Pray for me? I think about that now, and I can't remember another time he asked us to pray for him. And to keep watch? For what? I thought. There's just so much I didn't understand then. Jesus moved further away from us and seemed to collapse at the trunk of one of those primordial trees. In the shadows, it looked like his body was twisting like those ancient branches. It was as if he was in agony. I had never felt so afraid, but I didn't know why. But even stronger than my confusion and fear was my exhaustion. Peter and John had fallen asleep soon after they began to pray. I can't blame them. They had awakened early, gone ahead to Jerusalem, prepared the Passover meal for the rest of us, so I know they were tired. I fought sleep, but I too finally dozed myself. All that red wine, the heavy conversation, the night as thick and dark as the grave. The next thing I knew was Jesus shaking us, imploring us with a strangled question.
Can you not keep watch for just 1 hour?
There was such pain in his voice. There was a desperation. As we roused and turned back to our prayers, he strode off and fell to the ground, returning to his own prayers. And I could hear him. As he lifted his head to pray, I heard him speak of God's will and of suffering and of betrayal. And it caused me to return to his words from the dinner table.
One of you will betray me.
Who? Not we three, not Andrew. He was the most thoughtful man of the bunch. Philip? Of course not. Matthew? Maybe. He did work for the Romans for a season. But I had never seen anyone so transformed in a moment like Matthew had been. Then it struck me, where was Judas? He had been in the upper room. I'm sure of that. He sat right next to Jesus' side. He had eaten with us. But I couldn't remember him on our walk to the garden. Not unusual. He was the one who kept the money, was often sent out to purchase something or give money to someone in need. Had he been gone when we left the upper room? Or simply at the back of the line? Had he lost his way in the dark? No, of course not. He knew the city well. It was then that I became aware of lights heading our way. The sound of feet coming, and finally I heard his voice in the distance. This way, just a bit further. Almost there, he was saying. As I turned to wake Peter and John, there Jesus stood, his face a compilation of such a sorrow, almost unrecognizable. But his eyes held as steely resolve that was as frightening to me as my confusion had been. Judas arriving, leading a company of angry men. They had arrest warrants stamped with the seal of the high priest. And they were armed with swords, spears, and torches, dressed as a conquering army going to battle. All this for a few worn-out men in a garden praying? Thomas had warned us of the danger, but we believed nothing could overcome our master. So we stood there, huddled behind Jesus like frightened sheep, waiting for him to strike them down. Judas stepped forward, his face illuminated by a flickering torch, and the suspense only heightened. Jesus, with a haunting, knowing gaze, fixed Judas in his sights, and with a look of such pity, said gently,
My friend, do what you must do.
Rabbi, he said, and he kissed Jesus on the cheek. Chaos descended. Those men fell on Jesus like predators on prey. All the disciples scattered like spooked birds. And yes, I ran. I ran as hard as my old legs could carry me, all the way back to Bethany. I didn't know what happened until morning. But by morning, it was too late.
Peter recalls that night.
It was the darkest night of my life. And believe me, I've seen some bad nights. I've not always walked a straight and narrow. Not until Jesus. But traveling with Jesus hadn't been dull. There were dangers and adventures and things I'd never seen or imagined. There was that night on the Sea of Galilee. What a night! I've plied those waters since I was a lad, more than 40 years. Never had I seen such a storm. It descended on us double quick, and try as we might, I knew we were doomed. All 12 of us. Then a phantom, or so it seemed, came walking across the water. We all know the stories. You see a ghost on the sea, and you're doomed. But this was no ghost. It was Jesus. I didn't believe it at first. Would you? No, of course not. Who could believe such a thing? But I also know my master. So when he spoke, I called out, Lord, if it is you, then bid me to come to you on the water. And he answered,
Come on then.
I threw a leg over the starboard side to go to him. By the bones of Elijah, I knew it was crazy. But if it wasn't the master, I was seaman enough to know that we were doomed in this storm. I never liked to go down without a fight. It may have seemed foolish, but before Jesus, I had been a fool for the world far too often. I would rather die a fool for my master. I walked across that water. I'll never forget that. The thrill and then the terror as I began to feel the sea pulling me down. His hand lifting me up as if I were a cork on the water. He saved me in that storm. He saved us all. And that's what made that dark Thursday the darkest night of my life. I believed in this man. I loved him like nothing else I have ever wanted. I wanted to stand with him when he needed me the most. And I told him so. I told everyone.
Peter,
Was his reply.
the devil will grind you into the dust tonight. Before the morrow, before the rooster crows, you will deny that you even know me.
I couldn't believe he would say such a thing. And he said some sharp things to me over the years. But this? And in front of everyone. Not me. Let everyone else sink with the ship. Haven't I proven that I'll go further than anyone? Haven't I proven that I will go to the wall, to death if necessary? No, Sir Simon Peter does not go running from the battle. But I did. God help me, I did. After Judas handed Jesus over, I resisted. I pulled my sword out and started swinging with all my might. And Jesus told me, put the sword away. He said it in a way that pierced my inner being as cleanly as I had cut through that man's ear. And the sword fell from my hands. I just dropped the thing, never went back for it, and I ran away. Yet, I soon found my courage again, and I hurried to the home of the high priest, where I knew they would take him. And I huddled outside, waiting, listening, watching. I made the mistake of moving toward the courtyard fire. A cold damp had settled over the night, and I was trembling. A servant girl there peered at me through the smoke and called out, "Hey, you, yes, you. You're with that Nazarene. I've seen you with him." "I don't know what you're talking about," I barked. Before I even thought, then another, "Yes, I'm sure you are with this Jesus. You, too, are from Galilee. Your accent gives it away." I was terrified of being arrested, so I was even more forceful this time. "Heavens, no," I said. "I don't even know the man." But it wasn't enough. They pressed in. They cornered me until finally I thundered, "Curse you all and curse this Jesus. I tell you, I've never even met the man." Jesus was just inside the courtyard door. I could see him standing there, the accused, shackles on his wrists, like he was some kind of insurrectionist. Just as the rooster crowed, he turned and looked at me. Oh, the sadness in that gaze. Whether or not he heard my cursing, or that crow splitting the first soft glimmer of morning with its cry, it was of no matter. He knew. So did I. As fast as I could, I'm ashamed to say, I left that place. I left sobbing. I left wretched. I left ashamed. I left lost. It was the darkest night of my life.
Mary Magdalene.
James and a few of the others crashed through the door. It was after midnight, almost dawn. It put the whole household into a stir. They were trembling with fear, breathless, unable to speak. Never had I seen men so shaken. Mary and Lazarus and I did our best to calm them while Martha put on a pot of sackcloth on the fire to warm their bones. It took several minutes for them to be able to explain what had happened, and even then it was too unbelievable to accept. Jesus arrested? Judas a traitor? The disciples scattered and on the run? Not everyone was accounted for, but nobody knew where the others were. They didn't know what was happening to our Lord. That's when I knew I too had to run. I had to get to Jerusalem to see things for myself. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door when Martha stopped me. Mary Magdalene, my dear friend, you're like a daughter, so hear me. Please, don't go. I saw the concern in her face, and I understood. She continued, the night is late. The roads are filled with dangerous men. I gave her a smile, the kind of smile that said what needed not be said. I had spent more than one late night with dangerous men, and now the one man who had shown me how to live differently, the man who had changed my heart and my life was in trouble. I would not sit idly by if there was anything I could do. And there were just things and people I knew that would get me where others couldn't go. So I covered the miles from Bethany to Jerusalem along the same road the fleeing disciples had just taken as fast as I could run. Along the way, I thought of the times I had sat at the Master's feet, like Martha's sister, that other sweet and innocent Mary. I understood that this was no ordinary rabbi, never just a teacher, far beyond even a miracle worker. He knew things. He knew God. He understood people. He understood me. And he showed me that even I, could know and be loved by God. Hadn't we just been talking about Lazarus? Martha had told me he just suddenly fell sick and then he was gone, dead. Martha said she had sent word to Jesus, was so sad when he hadn't been able to return. For she and her sister Mary knew that Jesus could have saved him. I had been part of the crowd traveling with Jesus, and so I remember her kneeling at his feet, grieved that her brother was gone, grieved because Jesus had come too late to heal him, and she couldn't understand why. Yet it all became crystal clear when he had the tomb broken open and brought Lazarus back to life. I was not surprised. You see, I understand who Jesus is. And that's why I was beaming and dancing and thrilled at the procession a few days ago as he rode into the city. And it was why I went flying through the night, covering the ground with supernatural speed, determined to find my Lord. I understood the threat he had become and the danger he was in. I arrived at the high priest's house and met Peter running away from the courtyard. I tried to stop him and talk to him, but he bulldozed along, heaving with tears. I don't think he even knew who I was. To see that great hulk of a man so shattered scared me. It slowed me down, made me more careful. I crept quietly to a back door where I knew I could peek inside without being detected. I knew the way. I knew that door. I had been to this home before, though not a living one there would ever admit it. Looking inside, I had to stifle a shriek that rose in my throat, though it's doubtful I would have been heard. The Sanhedrin and priests were howling in bloodthirst. "Take him to Pilate," they were screaming. "He's a blasphemer. He doesn't deserve to live." And they spit on him, and they slapped him and kicked him to the ground. They dragged him around the floor. I wept. I felt utterly helpless. I felt suddenly so alone. As the temple guards took Jesus away, I saw his blood splattered on the floor. It lay there in sharp contrast to the expensive white marble. It was Passover. Perhaps it was natural, but as the room emptied and the silence fell, I looked at those stains splashed on the ground and was reminded of the blood of the lambs that had marked the door frames of the people of the Exodus. That blood had covered the people from the curses that were overtaking the land. But it had come at quite a cost. There is no freedom, no safety, no covering, no hope for peace without the sacrifice. I turned my broken heart and my tear-stained face toward Bethany. I had to tell the others. What is coming will continue to be an unending day of terror for the disciples and his followers. As the sun rises, there will be a day that holds nothing but grief and pain and sorrow and uncertainty and such a feeling of loss. And the greatest of sacrifices. Turn your own broken heart inward. Sit in silence. Sit and pray. And then go and prepare yourself for what is to come.